Hey everyone, Pastor George here today. Wonderful to see you all for our new thing. Excited to be here. And I'm talking about something that I've actually thought a lot about. And normally I just shoot from the hip. So, I might actually have something interesting to say today. And it's topical, although we're actually not going to talk too much about the thing that it's topical about because a little morbid, and I'll get into that in a little bit. Anyway, our theme for today is nature, but actually, it's not nature in the sense of you know, how beautiful nature is or how we should keep it alive and stewardship of nature, which is usually like when you think, if you've heard sermons or you hear people talk about it, the Bible talk about nature, right? A lot of people like to emphasize that because those are things that we emphasize now. Not saying they aren't important. I think stewardship of the earth is a very important thing. I think nature is beautiful, although I stay far away from it, and we're gonna find out why that is. That's not necessarily true. I don't stay that far away from it. I like to play that up, but I do think I understand it in a different way than a lot of other people, but not a lot of other people. I think we all understand this, but what I emphasize is usually very different. I'm not an original thinker, so what I emphasize is usually just different than what a lot of other people emphasize. So for today, I wanted to look at our Bible passages. So let me pull these up. The first is Genesis 1, which is a great place to start, obviously. This is the creation narrative of Genesis 1, but I wanted to get down to where he creates humanity, creates mankind, whatever word you want to use. So then it says, then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. So very famous passage, right? We actually, in G3, we have a song where we sing verse 27. Sorry, so this is a very famous part of the narrative, very important part of the Bible, right? Because this has a lot about us as people, where we are made in God's image, and that means that we need to respect the body and the people who are in it, right? This is a whole part of Christian theology called the Imago Dei, which is the image of God. And it all has to do with how we respond to that idea in other people, right? So we can't just abuse or torture or be rude to other people because they are made in God's image, right? So they reflect the Creator in some way, and we can't just mistreat them, right? This would be for really important if we wanted to make a Christian case against genocide, for instance, right? Because a lot of people, a lot of cultures would have been totally fine just with wiping people out and treating them terribly, right? Why can we as Christians not do that? Well, because of the image of God. But I'm not here to talk about the image of God. In fact, I want to talk about those verses surrounding verse 27 and 26 and 28. In that, right, God says we, and he uses the royal we here in Hebrew, and I think that that's because God is Trinity, right? This is a very Christian reading of this passage, that God himself is in relationship, right? He's a God of relationship between the persons that make him up, and so he says, let us make mankind in our image and our likeness. And it's interesting, why does he do this? Well, not only because it's kind of what he wants, but what's interesting is we usually think of likeness as how we look, and that might be what part of it is, but what, like, the idea of likeness here carries with it a responsibility. So you see, so that they may rule over the fish, like we take on a little part of God's character and God's providence here, right? That we in his stead rule over the fish of the sea, the birds in the sky, the livestock and wild animals, over creatures that move along the ground, right? That's like what we're able to do as humans. We are called into that as a purpose. And you'll see that God again says this, right? After he creates humanity, he blesses them and says, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves upon the ground, right? So he repeats what he said earlier. not it's not a complete copy of what was said earlier, but he tells them to subdue the earth, right? And so subduing the earth is ruling over it, right? And this is a really interesting thing to think about when it comes to how we relate to it, right? How do we see ourselves? Well, and sometimes this can mean like we just take over and we can do whatever we want. I don't think that's what this passage is telling us to do, but like that humanity has a special ability to control the world in ways that other species can't. Why? Because we're made in God's image. We have dominion over this creation that he made, right? Now he's obviously has ultimate dominion, but we also have that. So this is a very pro-humanity, having a lot of power over nature part of the Bible, right? In the sense that we rule over all the other animals. Now I wanted to look at another part of the Old Testament, Psalm 107. And I actually wrote a paper on this psalm for my Psalms class when I was in seminary. And this really has not a lot to do with it. I just find this really interesting, this particular psalm, because one of my video games quotes it. So I had a particular attachment to it because it was one of the psalms I could quote from a video game that I played. But anyway, this is Psalm 107. It starts off by saying, "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever." And what it does actually is it recounts a lot of stories of people who rebelled against God and how God brought judgment down upon them and then restored some of them who turned back to him. And this is really interesting because a lot of this happens through nature and natural causes. I can only think of one that doesn't in this. The rest of them have to do with some natural disaster falling upon people or them being stuck in some sort of desperate kind of situation. So, for instance, in verse 4, it says, "Some wandered in desert wastelands, finding no way to a city where they could settle. They were hungry and thirsty, and their lives ebbed away. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He led them by a straight way to a city where they could settle. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. For he satisfies the thirsty and fills the hungry with good things." This you probably recognize, right? For this is very similar to what Mary says in the Magnificat, right? That's just really interesting there. So anyway, right? You have people stuck out in the desert, don't know where they're going, they're lost, right? But the Lord, they cried to help, and he comes and he rescues them from their distress. This is the one that has more to do with like human things, right? Because it has to do with prisoners suffering in iron chains. So it's some people that were probably rebelled and taken as slaves and things like that. And God frees them out of that, which is not a bad thing to talk about, just not what I want, not on my focus. So here we have, "Some became fools through their rebellious ways and suffered affliction because of their iniquities. They loathed all food and drew near the gates of death. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. He sent out his word and healed them. He rescued them from the grave. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. Let them sacrifice thank offerings and tell of his works with songs of joy." You'll see that "let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind" repeats quite a lot. And so does "they cried to the Lord in the time of trouble, and he saved them from their distress." That also repeats in these things. So you have here, right, like this is still nature, because this is plague. This is like an uncontrollable thing that happens, right? Pestilence, affliction, right? Here it attaches this to people rebelling against the Lord, and people being fools. And fools in the Old Testament doesn't mean stupid or idiotic. It means someone who's not wise, who doesn't listen to the Lord, who turns against him, right? Doesn't mean that you're necessarily a stupid person, maybe, but you're just unwise. I think is the best way to say it. And then he talks about this, right? He says, "Some went out on the sea in ships. They were merchants on the mighty waters. They saw the works of the Lord and his wonderful deeds in the deep." This is the line that I know from it right here, from one of the video games I played. "For he spoke and stirred up a tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths. In their peril, their courage melted away. They reeled and staggered like drunkards. They were at their wits' end. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds in the deep. So here we have a bunch of merchants, right, sailing probably on the Mediterranean is the idea here, right? And this was something that is seen as very lucrative, right? We see trade as such a normal thing, but like back in the day, it was a risky venture, right? Think of like when the first people started trading between America and Europe, right, where they would sail over, gather resources, whatever, and send them back, and all of that was really like it was like the corporations. I don't know if you know this, but corporations were basically founded to do that because there was so much risk involved with trading across the Atlantic that the only way that you could really do that in a way was to form these companies, right? This is why we have stuff like the East India Company and the West India Company and stuff like that, right? Or the Virginia Company, the New England Company, right? It's because they would have to pay people, like they'd have to pool their money together. You'd invest and you'd get a little bit of the profits when they brought the cotton back or whatever it is, right? And it was really dangerous. And we usually don't see it that way today. We see it as being like, relatively safe profession, but same thing in the ancient world, even more so, right? Ships were even less sturdy back then. And so they would make great money sailing around the Mediterranean from Egypt to Canaan to Greece to wherever, right? And they would also put themselves in a lot of danger because of the storms. And so here, this is about merchants who get stuck on the sea, and they end up turning to the Lord, right? Because the waves, the storm is going to kill them, and he saves them. And then, of course, there's this the last one right here, which is talking about how the Lord brings kind of natural disaster on people who turned away from him and the wickedness of this people who were living there. But he eventually restores all of that stuff that happens. And then it ends by saying, let the one who is wise heed these things and ponder the loving deeds of the Lord, right? So you look at this and you see how humanity isn't in control. And I bring this psalm out in particular because there's a lot of stuff that has to do with nature, right? Not having control over things that are happening on nature, whether it's like getting stuck in a wilderness or plague or being stuck out on the ocean where you can't do anything or natural disasters, right? The Lord is still in control of those things. And so it's kind of like a balance. And I think humanity is forever caught in this balance between we have dominion and rule over the earth and we should go forth and conquer, right? Like Alexander the Great. Or we are kind of like just nature's playthings and there's not much we can do about it. And the truth is really kind of in the middle because there are great stories of conquest, like the first climbing of Everest and things like that. But there's also stories of the opposite. Now, for those of you who know what's going on in the world, you probably know why I'm talking about this. And it has to do with that missing sub that is going on with the Titanic. In fact, let me see. There's a new update. What's this about? All right, Coast Guard is going to continue to search. So this is just, I pulled this up. I didn't particularly choose NBC. I just kind of just saw the first link because I wanted to have something on the screen. So as you know, there was a tourist sub, right? They've been doing, this one company has been running these tours for like people who can afford it, like really rich people who save up like 200 or maybe not as rich people, but people who put forward $250,000 to take this sub to go down to see the Titanic, which I think a lot of us would think is pretty cool. I mean, I think that's pretty cool. I'm a history guy, and so for me, it would be pretty interesting to actually see the Titanic, what's left of it anyway. I really wish. Unfortunately, it sunk at such a low level that it's nearly impossible to bring up, right? If it had sunk in a more kind of, I think it fell kind of into a trench. And so it's really unfortunate because if it was in a place where it was a little lower, or a little higher rather, we'd be able to reach it a lot better and maybe even bring it up, but it's too far now and we just don't have, it's like 12,000 feet below the surface. And so there's just no way that we're going to be able to do that unless technology radically changes, which is possible. Anyway, as you know, this company, or as you might not know, but you may know too, this company's run these tours, and it's a way to kind of explore things that we haven't seen before. The only people who have had access to the Titanic, which you have to remember was actually found relatively recently. The reason that James Cameron's movie Titanic it was such a blockbuster success was not because Billy Zane is the best character in it, because he's the most fun to watch, although that is very true. It's actually because, for those of you who remember, the Titanic was first really discovered right before it. And James Cameron actually went down and in a sub and took footage of the Titanic, and he uses that in the movie and things like that. But that was like big deal when it was found, because people didn't really know what it was, and it was way too deep, right? It was only when we had the technology to go that low we were actually able to find the Titanic. So they went down, this group, right, and they lost contact with the surface about an hour and 45 minutes into their dive, and it's been a rush since Sunday to try and find them, because they only have about 4 days of oxygen, and today is like the day that they're supposed to run out. Right now, I'm not going to comment on this but say they're going to die or whatever, or let me see it updated again, unless it says it right now, right? So it's just a bunch of people are trying to help, right? The French are helping, the Canadians, Americans, everyone's kind of like trying to find the Navy, the Coast Guard, like are trying to find this. Problem is it's just so low that it's really hard to scan that distance. So it's really, really sad, right? But this really made me think of this, because this is a really good example to me of that tension where we're at, right? Where it's like humans want to go and explore and show that we can go to these bone-crushing depths, right, beneath the waves to find stuff. And that's actually really cool that we're able to do stuff like that. But on the other hand, right, we're not invincible. Things can go wrong. Now, I hope that a miracle happens and that they are able to find these people and somehow bring them back to the surface. I don't know how that would happen, but I hope it does. The way that ideally that these people, I don't mean to be morbid, but ideally the way that these people would die is that hopefully their sub ruptured and they just died instantly from the pressure change. But if they are still alive, because they've said they've heard underwater noises, but that we don't know what that is that they are running out of oxygen, and that's a pretty unfortunate way to go. So I really hope that they are found. But any of the case, what this reminded me of, though, because I don't want to focus on this, I'd rather talk about another instance of this happening where we can talk about this balance. So this is a poem that was written in 1850 by Alfred Lord Tennyson. This is the Wikipedia page for it, because I just wanted to find one part of it, called In Memoriam of A.H.H. He wrote it in memory of a friend. And it has a lot of stuff to say about, like, kind of, this is 1850 is really not in the beginning, but the start of where we like to think about the Victorian era, right? The 1800s is defined by the Victorian era, and it's this idea of the reign of Queen Victoria in England, which starts in the early 1800s and goes to the late 1800s, right? She's one of the longest reigning queens, largely seen as a wonderful queen because she presides over the British Empire at its greatest extent. And in the 1800s, you had this absolute explosion of scientific knowledge and exploration, right? This is like when the maps were being filled in, and we started to really understand, especially in these places that were really out there and stuff like that, that humanity was starting to completely understand. Like, you have to, like, whether or not you believe in everything that came out of this time period, you have to remember that this is where a lot of modern physics began to be kind of established. This is where chemistry began to establish. Like, you think of dynamite, stuff like that, right? War, like the technology that we use now, a lot of that was starting to be established at this time, right? The Civil War takes place during this period. The theory of evolution is first proposed during the Victorian period. Electricity is being used, right? You have the light bulb. Thomas Edison is during this period. So, like, all of this is coming out, right? All of this is like a big deal that is starting to uh, begin to shape the world that we live in. And so the Victorian period, especially in Europe, in the United States, it's like this on the East Coast, but not so much because the Wild West is basically the same time frame as the Victorian period. But like it has this idea of culture and refinement and humanity just going upwards. That there's just this upwards trend that we're just going to get better and better. And this actually affected theology at the time, right? There's this whole I think it's premillennial belief, right? That like the world is going to get really, really good, and then Christ is going to come back, right? And that is really popular. It was like the most popular way of viewing the end times during the Victorian period, and it's easy to see why. Because the world seems to be getting, and I think it did in a lot of ways, get better and better and better. And then the 20th century happens, and you see the reaction to that, right? What we do with that technology and how it affects us, and you see that maybe it's not so good as we thought it once was. But whatever the case, you have this tension in the Victorian period because you have people who believe that nature can be conquered, right? We know where the origins of life are from. We can travel around the world and find places and conquer them and stuff like that. It's very triumphalist, right? But in this memoriam of HHH, and you might have heard this phrase before, he has this famous line where he talks about nature. And he says, "Who trusted God was love indeed, and love creation's final law, though nature red in tooth and claw, with ravine shrieked against his creed." So this is a very famous line, nature red in tooth and claw. And what that means is red is in the color red, in tooth, teeth, like there's blood on their teeth and on their claws, right? And you actually see that here, Tennyson is saying, like God is love, right? And love is creation's final law because that's who defines who God is. But nature itself is incredibly brutal. It's red in tooth and claw, and it constantly rebels against God's designs. And that's why bad things happen in nature and things like that. It's a really interesting poem. It's a long poem. It's like 90 pages, but it's a really interesting tension that Tennyson is drawing there, and it's really Victorian because it's like they understand, because they're still a Christian society, what they're being called to do and like what that means and what that says about humanity, but at the same time there's so much optimism. It's kind of like balancing these two things. And what this reminded me of was this painting called, and this is what I'm going to name the episode after, "Man Proposes, God Disposes," which comes from a Latin phrase used by a mystic or like a writer in the medieval period. It's this painting, and it's inspired by this expedition that happened, Franklin's Lost Expedition, which is here. It was a try to find the Northwest Passage. And the Northwest Passage is this water route that is supposedly supposed to go over the Americas around, which would be way quicker to do trade on. And everyone wanted to try and find the Northwest Passage. So Franklin was one of these British explorer guys with the Royal Navy who tried to find it, and it ended up going completely wrong. And you can actually see that they've traced his path, right, where he goes up, and that's really interesting because you can kind of see, man, if he just took some different turns, he would have found the Northwest Passage. Now it's completely useless. It's all of this is ice, right? If there's a book based on this called The Terror, which was mediocre / pretty bad in my estimation. I've heard the show is better, but I've never seen it, and I'd like to. Has a good cast, but whatever. So all of this is ice. So they get trapped in the ice, and they end up getting stuck, and everyone in the expedition dies, right? That's how this expedition ends. In fact, they actually just found, I guess just would be 10 years ago, almost 9 years ago, which is still relatively recent, but they actually found the wreck of one of the ships, the Erebus, in 2014, down here where there was 4. And so they were able to see that, like, hey, they where they went and that they made it and were able to find it, and it's pretty cool that they can do such thing. But the guy who did this, the artist, he never said that this was what it was about. But when this happened, this Lost Expedition, it was a huge deal in the UK because it basically served as because these ships were state of the art. They had indoor heating because they knew that they were going to have like face incredibly cold temperatures. It was the first time that food was canned, right? Like, I know we all say, like, we have a food pantry full of it, but like that was a huge new technology at the time, and it could be preserved for a really long time. Food was canned, right? They brought all sorts of modern equipment and supplies, and in like on and again, it's like the whole like, hey, nothing bad will happen type of thing, right? We're perfect and we've conquered the world, kind of like the Titanic, right? Like this idea that it's unsinkable or whatever. Although I actually think that the people who, that's a myth. I don't actually think the people who made the Titanic ever claimed that it was unsinkable. I think that's like a later thing. But anyway, there's this idea that we have the technology, right? We can easily do this sort of thing. And then you have the artist here showing the destruction, or the destroyed remains of the ship. You can see bones here, presumably from the crew, which this polar bear is munching on over there, and the other one's ripping apart the it looks like a flag. Doesn't look like flesh to me, but maybe that's what it's supposed to be. You can see the spyglass on the ground over there, you know, and it shows that nature ultimately conquers whatever type of that nature still has a trump card on us, basically, that it can still conquer humanity. And I think what this is about to me, and I'm not referring to just to the you know, maybe there is a little bit of this in this, but it's, I don't want to say that this is the cause, but there is this idea of humanity with our balance, right? In some ways, we believe that we can easily conquer and defeat nature, right? We can be really hubristic, move above our place, thinking that we are actually the ones completely in control. But really, when it comes to our relationship with it and our ability to explore, is that we are not in control, right? God is in control. And sometimes that we overstep, or we think we are more powerful than we are, and there's nothing that kind of puts you in your place more than when just the brutality of nature, and I do believe nature is a brutal thing. It is lovely and it is beautiful, but it is also very brutal, is able to put us back into our place and remind us that we are not as powerful and strong and conquering as we once or as we like to think ourselves of. So I wanted to talk about that just because this sub situation reminded me of it. Again, hope they get found. Don't want anything bad to happen to them. But you know, but it made me think of other exploration things that we as humans like to engage with, that often we might end up overshooting or overextending ourselves a little bit too much. Whatever the case, I'm glad that all of you were able to join me today for this new thing. I hope to see you guys in church on Sunday. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your Thursday, and peace out.